Welcome to week 1 of Introduction Survey of the Old Testament. The theme for this week is biblical interpretation in the beginning. So we begin our reading with Genesis and Exodus in the Old Testament, and then in our textbook we will be reading literally about biblical interpretation and what's at stake. What my hope for you is that you'll gain the big picture as you read through Genesis and Exodus. It's about manna and mercy. It's about God created and said it was good. God created so that God could have God's presence in community with human beings. And then as the familiar story of Adam and Eve and what's called the fall, and sin entered into the world, and Adam and Eve and humanity were evicted from the Garden of Eden. It is a story about us being evicted from the presence of God. And then the story continues as the restoration for God to reunite God's self with God's people so that we are in relationship with God, and that is the whole journey through the Old Testament and continues on into the New Testament. So the theme here is manna and mercy. Creation, it was good. Sin entered in the Garden of Eden. Chapter 1 to 11 talks about why there is a need for God to reveal God's self because of sin, because of murder, because of the Tower of Babel that was built for the deity to come down and to control the deity, come down to us when we want you. Chapter 12 to 50 then are about God initiating a plan to reconnect with God's people. Manna is about covenant. God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, where he calls him to go in from his place that he's living, go to this new place that I've called you to be, and you will be blessed, and all nations will be blessed through you. The blessing is God. The blessing is God, that through the presence of Abraham and God's chosen people, the world would know God's love. God is both manna and mercy. And then in Exodus, we'll learn that as the Israelites are being freed from slavery, from bondage, and brought into the promised land, then laws begin to be established. And we learn about the lawmaker by the laws that God establishes. God says, I am holy, and so therefore you will be holy. That was unheard of in the ancient world. You expected the God to be holy. You expected that. But Yahweh, Jehovah, raised the bar and said, because I am holy, you will be holy. And there then goes the laws that were delineated throughout much of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, beginning in Exodus, where they are outlined on how you will be holy because Yahweh is different, and therefore my people will be different as well. So the overview of the first 2 chapters, the first 2 books of the Old Testament: creation, it was good. Sin enters the world. Cain kills Abel, his brother. And when God calls him on it, Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? In other words, am I responsible for my brother? And God says, yes. And then Noah and the flood, the covenant with Noah, the Tower of Babel, the call of Abram in Genesis 12, and the Joseph narrative, which continues through the end of the book of Genesis, which brings us to the beginning of Exodus, where the Israelites are in slavery. And Moses is called, and his job is to free his people, the people of God. And so as Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go, we have the famous plagues, the Passover of the Lamb in Exodus 12, and then as they're poised on the edge of the Nile River and fear comes again and the Israelites want to go back to the known slavery of the past rather than face the uncertainty. And yet in faith, the waters are parted, they walk across on dry land. Miriam, who is Moses' sister, dances across with the women and the celebration that there is freedom. Then they're in the desert. God provides manna and quail. The 10 Commandments in Exodus 12, the golden calf, then the laws are introduced for justice and mercy. And then finally in Exodus chapter 40, The ark is complete, the tabernacle is ready, and God enters. So the holy presence of God then is once again with the people of God, which is the first time that has happened since Adam and Eve were evicted from the garden in Genesis. So that brings us for the readings for this week from the Bible. And then as you go through and read the textbook, you'll learn about the hermeneutics of the Old Testament. Hermeneutics is a fancy academic word which simply means interpretation, the lens through which we look. And so we are going to be looking at interpretation from the grammatical historical method. You'll see a summary on this on page 30 of Encountering the Old Testament, the textbook for the class. So number one, you need to understand the context. What's going on immediately right now in the story, the chapter, the particular piece of scripture that you're reading. What's going on in the bigger chapters going on around it? Why is this happening? What's happening? And then what's the overall historical context for the time and place and century where it's situated? And then determine the type of literature. In the Bible, there are many, many different types of literature. Just like when you pick up the Sunday morning paper to read. You've got comics, you've got the front page, you've got Ann Landers, you've got want ads, you've got some news, you've got some gossip. It's all over the place. So is Scripture. There are many different genres that you're going to be reading about, and so look to see, is this narrative? Is it telling a story? Is it poetry? Is it prophetic, meant to change lives, change behavior? Or is it law? Is it historical? Is it about what's going on with priestly worship of God? How is it related in any one of these categories? And then there's going to be some figurative language that we're going to need to interpret. It's not a direct translation from the Hebrew of the ancient to what is translated in your scripture to what we understand in our vocabulary today. One of the rules for interpretation, guidelines actually, which came out of the Protestant Reformation, is let Scripture interpret Scripture. In other words, if you read a difficult passage that doesn't quite make sense to you, well, this says something kind of hard about God, I'm not sure what that means. Look at it in the bigger picture and let what we know and read about God elsewhere help us to understand this particular passage. Avoid what's called proof texting, taking one slice and dice piece of Scripture and saying, well, that's the way it is in all places and all times. Because we really need to look and see what does God say about a similar situation in another passage of Scripture, even in a completely different section of the Bible. So let Scripture interpret Scripture is very, very important. And then finally, relate what you're learning to a contemporary context. What would be a parallel in your life and in your world and what's going on today? If you were to read the Bible on one hand and the newspaper on the other, how does what you're reading in Scripture inform what you are reading in the newspaper, what's going on in the dailiness of life? As you get into the section on laws, as you get about halfway into the book of Exodus, you start getting some heavy hitter laws, and that can be a little overwhelming. It seems like a rule book, which in fact that's not exactly so, but it can appear that as you're reading it. Martin Luther, who was part of the Protestant Reformation and one of the founder of the Lutheran Church as we know it today, he had 3 suggestions on how to look at the laws in the Old Testament. There's how you can help you to understand for contemporary relevance. Number 1 is civil law. So it's appointing judges, the judicial system. We can learn something from this, but there's not a one-to-one direct parallel, direct relationship from the biblical times to the present, because lives are very different. What's going on in our world is very different. But we can learn from that and understand from that. And second, then there's ceremonial law, which is about worship, about ritual, about what's called the cult and the tabernacle, the temple worship. This does not apply today because of Good Friday, because these laws were taken care of by Jesus Christ. And then third are the moral laws. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. Care for the widow, the alien, the orphan, and the poor. These are binding. These are ethical, moral laws of which we are ethically and moral responsible for. So ask yourself, when you're in any of the sections covering the law, is the law ceremonial? Is the law civil? Is the law moral? or spiritual. And all of the time as you're doing your reading, remember to keep a journal, a notebook of some kind, whether it's written or whether it is an online digital source, so that as you're writing down the bold type of each one of the chapters as you read, what's the main lesson, the main that you would tell someone about Genesis, about Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy as we continue on. So that will help you as we continue on our journey together of reading the Old Testament, studying it, and learning the bold type and what it means for servant leadership in a postmodern context in our world today. Thank you.